हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो आज हम देखेंगे एनसीईआरटी क्लास 9 हिस्ट्री का चैप्टर नंबर 5 जो कि है पेस्ट्रलिस्ट इन द मॉडर्न वर्ल्ड। तो शुरू करते हैं हमारा आज का चैप्टर। In this chapter you will read about nomadic pastoralists. Nomads are people who do not live in one place but move from one area to another to earn their living. In many parts of India, we can see nomadic pastoralists on the move with their herds of goats and sheep, or camels and cattle. Have you ever wondered where they are coming from and where they are headed? Do you know how they live and earn? What their past has been? Pastoralists rarely enter the pages of history textbooks. When you read about the economy, whether in your classes of history or economics, you learn about agriculture and industry. Sometimes you read about artisans, but rarely about pastoralists, as if their lives do not matter, as if they are figures from the past who have no place in modern society. In this chapter, you will see how pastoralism has been important in societies like India and Africa. You will read about the way colonialism impacted their lives and how they coped with the pressures of modern society. The chapter will first focus on India and then Africa. Pastoral nomads and their movements. In the mountains. Even today, the Gujar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir are great herders of goat and sheep. Many of them migrated to this region in the 19th century in search of pastures for their animals. Gradually, over the decades, they established themselves in the area and moved annually between their summer and winter grazing grounds. In winter, when the high mountains were covered with snow, they lived with their herds in the low hills of the Sivalik range. The dry scrub forest here provided pasture for their herds. By the end of April, they began their northern march for their summer grazing grounds. Several households came together for this journey, forming what is known as kafila. They crossed the Pir Panjal passes and entered the valley of Kashmir. With the onset of summer, the snow melted and the mountain sides were lush green. The variety of grasses that sprouted provided rich nutritious forage for the animal herds. By end September, the Bakarwals were on the move again, this time on their downward journey, back to their winter base. When the high mountains were covered with snow, the herds were grazed in the low hills. Writing in the 1850s, G.C. Varnes gave the following description of Gujars of Kangra. In the hills, the Gujars are exclusively a pastoral tribe. They cultivate scarcely at all. The Gaddis keep flocks of sheep and goats, and the Gujars' wealth consists of buffaloes. These people live in the skirts of the forest and maintain their existence exclusively by the sale of the milk, ghee, and other produce of their herds. The men graze and the cattle and frequently lie out for weeks in the woods tending their herds. The women repair to the markets every morning with baskets on their heads, with little earthen pots filled with milk, buttermilk, and ghee, each of these pots containing the proportion required for a day's meal. During the hot weather, the Gujars usually drive their herds to the upper range where the buffaloes rejoice in the rich grass which the rains bring forth, and at the same time attain condition from the temperate climate and the immunity from venomous flies that torment their existence in the plains. In a different area of the mountains, the Gaddis of Himachal Pradesh had a similar cycle of seasonal movement. They too spent their winter in low hills of Sivalik range, grazing their flocks in scrub forest. By April, they moved north and spent the summer in Lahore and Spiti. When the snow melted and the high passes were clear, many of them the moved onto higher mountain meadows. By September, they began their return movement. On the way, they stopped once again in the villages of Lahore and Spiti, reaping their summer harvest and sowing their winter crop. Then they descended with their flock to the winter grazing ground on the Sibalik hills. Next April, once again, they began their march with their goats and sheep to the summer meadows. Further to the east, in Gharwal and Kumaon, the Gujar cattle herders came down to the dry forest of the Bhavar in the winter and went out to the high meadows, the Bugals, in summer. Many of them were originally from Jammu and came to the UP hills in the 19th century in search of good pastures. Bhavar, a dry forested area below the foothills of Gharwal and Kumaon. Bugal, vast meadows in the high mountains. This pattern of cyclical movement between summer and winter pastures was typical of many pastoral communities of the Himalayas, including the Bhutias, Sherpas, and Kinnuris. All of them had to adjust to seasonal changes and make effective use of available pastures in different places. When the pasture was exhausted or unusable in one place, they moved their herds and flock to new areas. This continuous movement also allowed the pastures to recover. It prevented their overuse. On the plateaus, plains, and deserts, not all pastoralists operated in the mountains. They were also to be found in the plateaus, plains, and deserts of India. Dhangars were an important pastoral community of Maharashtra. In the early 20th century, their population in this region was estimated to be 467,000. Most of them were shepherds, some were blanket weavers, and still others were buffalo herders. The Dhangar shepherds stayed in the central plateau of Maharashtra during the monsoon. This was a semi-arid region with low rainfall and poor soil. It was covered with thorny scrub. Nothing but dry crops like bajra could be sown here. In the monsoon, this tract became a vast grazing ground for the Dhangar flocks. By October, the Dhangars harvested their bajra and started on their move west. After a march of about a month, they reached the Konkan. This was a flourishing agricultural tract with high rainfall and rich soil. Here, the shepherds were welcomed by Konkani pigeons. After the Kharif harvest was cut at this time, the fields had to be fertilized and made ready for the Rabi harvest. Dhangar flocks manured the fields and fed on the stubble. Kharif, the autumn crop, usually harvested between September and October. Rabi, the spring crop, usually harvested after March. Stubble, lower ends of grain stalks left in the ground after harvesting. The Konkani pigeons also gave supplies of rice, which the shepherds took back to the plateau where grain was scarce. With the onset of the monsoon, the Dhangars left the Konkan and the coastal areas with their flocks and returned to their settlements on the dry plateau. The sheep could not tolerate the wet monsoon conditions. In Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, again, the dry central plateau was covered with stone and grass, inhabited by cattle, goat, and sheep herders. The Golas herded cattle. The Kurmas and Kurbas reared sheep and goats and sold woven blankets. They lived near the woods, cultivated small patches of land, engaged in a variety of petty trades, and took care of their herds. Unlike the mountain pastoralist, it was not the cold and the snow that defined the seasonal rhythms of their movement. Rather, it was the alteration of the monsoon and dry season. In the dry season, they moved to the coastal tracts and left when the rains came. Only buffaloes liked the swampy, wet conditions of the coastal areas during the monsoon months. Other herds had to be shifted to the dry plateau at this time. Banjaras were yet another well known group of grazers. They were to be found in the villages of Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra. In search of good pasture land for their cattle, they moved over long distances, selling plug cattle and other goods to villages in exchange for grain and fodder. The accounts of many travelers tell us about the life of pastoral groups. In the early 19th century, Bachnan visited the Kolas during their travel through Mysore. He wrote, "Their families live in small villages near the skirt of the woods, where they cultivate a little ground and keep some of their cattle, selling in the towns the produce of the dairy. Their families are very numerous, 7 to 8 young men in each being common. 2 or 3 of these attend the flocks in the woods, while the remainder cultivate their fields and supply the towns with firewood and with straw for thatch." In the deserts of Rajasthan lived the Raikas. The rainfall in the region was mixed and uncertain. On cultivated land, harvest fluctuated every year. Over vast stretches, no crop could be grown, so the Raikas combined cultivation with pastoralism. During the monsoons, the Raikas of Barmer, Jaisalmer, Jodhpur, and Bikaner stayed in their home villages where pastures was available. By October, when these grazing grounds were dry and exhausted, they moved out in search of other pasture and water, and returned again during the next monsoon. One group of Raikas, known as the Maru Desert Raikas, herded camels, and another group reared sheep and goat. So we see that the life of these pastoral groups was sustained by a careful consideration of a host of factors. They had to judge how long the herds could stay in one area and know where they could find water and pasture. They needed to calculate the timing of their movements and ensure that they could move through different territories. They had to set up a relationship with farmers on the way so that the herds could graze in the harvested fields and manure the soil. They combined a range of different activities cultivation, trade, and herding to make their living. How did the life of pastoralists change under colonial rule? Colonial rule and pastoral life. Under colonial rule, the life of pastoralists changed dramatically. Their grazing grounds shrank, their movements were regulated, and the revenue they had to pay increased. Their agricultural stock declined, and their trades and crafts were adversely affected. How? H.S. Gibson, the deputy conservator of forest, Darjeeling, wrote in 1913, "Forest which is used for grazing cannot be used for any other purpose and is unable to yield timber and fuel, which are the main legitimate forest produce." First, the colonial state wanted to transform all grazing lands into cultivated farms. Land revenue was one of the main sources of its finance. By expanding cultivation, it could increase its revenue collection. It could at the same time produce more jute, cotton, wheat, and other agricultural produce that were required in England. To colonial officials, all uncultivated land appeared to be unproductive. It produced neither revenue nor agricultural produce. It was seen as wasteland that needed to be brought under cultivation. From the mid 19th century, wasteland rules were enacted in various parts of the country. By these rules, uncultivated lands were taken over and given to select individuals. These individuals were granted various concessions and encouraged to settle these lands. Some of them were made headmen of villages in the newly cleared areas. In most areas, the lands taken over were actually grazing tracts used regularly by pastoralists. So, expansion of cultivation inevitably meant the decline of pastures and a problem for pastoralists. Second, by the mid 19th century, various forest acts were also being enacted in different provinces. Through these acts, some forests which produced commercially valuable timber like deodar or sal were declared reserved. No pastoralist was allowed to access to this forest. Other forests were classified as protected. In this, some customary grazing rights of pastoralists were granted, but their movements were severely restricted. The colonial officials believed that grazing destroyed the saplings and young shoots of trees that germinated on the forest floor. The herds trampled over the saplings and munched away the shoots. This prevented new trees from growing. Customary rights that people are used to by custom and tradition. These forest acts changed the lives of pastoralists. They were now prevented from entering many forests that had earlier provided valuable forests for their cattle. Even in the areas they were allowed entry, their movements were regulated. They needed a permit for entry. The timing of their entry and departure was specified, and the number of days they could spend in the forest was limited. Pastoralists could no longer remain in an area even if forest was available. The grass was succulent and the undergrowth in the forest was ample. They had to move because the forest department permits that had been issued to them now ruled their lives. The permit specified the periods in which they could be legally within a forest. If they overstayed, they were liable to fines. Third, British officials were suspicious of nomadic people. They distrusted mobile craftsmen and traders who hawked their goods in villages and pastoralists who changed their places of residence every season, moving in search of good pastures for their herds. The colonial government wanted to rule over a settled population. They wanted the rural people to live in villages in fixed places with fixed rights on particular fields. Such a population was easy to identify and control. Those who were settled were seen as peaceable and law abiding. Those who were nomadic were considered to be criminal. In 1871, the colonial government in India passed the Criminal Tribes Act. By this act, many communities of craftsmen, traders, and pastoralists were classified as criminal tribes. They were stated to be criminal by nature and birth. Once this act came into force, these communities were expected to live only in notified village settlements. They were not allowed to move out without a permit. The village police kept a continuous watch on them. In the 1920s, a Royal Commission on Agriculture reported the extent of the area available for grazing has gone down tremendously with the extension of area under cultivation because of increasing population, extension of irrigation facilities, acquiring the pastures for government purposes, for example, defense, industries, and agricultural experimental farms. Now, breeders find it difficult to raise large herds, thus, their earnings have gone down. The quality of their livestock has deteriorated, dietary standards have fallen, and indebtedness has increased. Fourth, to expand its revenue income, the colonial government looked for every possible source of taxation. So, tax was imposed on land, on canal water, on salt, on trade goods, and even on animals. Pastoralists had to pay tax on every animal they grazed on the pastures. In most pastoral tracts of India, grazing tax was introduced in the mid 19th century. The tax per head of cattle went up rapidly and the system of collection was made increasingly efficient. In the decades between the 1850s and 1880s, the right to collect the tax was auctioned out to contractors. These contractors tried to extract as high a tax as they could to recover the money they had paid to the state and earn as much profit as they could within the year. By the 1880s, the government began collecting taxes directly from the pastoralists. Each of them was given a pass. To enter a grazing tract, a cattle herder had to show the pass and pay the tax. The number of cattle heads he had and the amount of tax he paid was entered on the pass. How did these changes affect the life of pastoralists? These measures led to a serious shortage of pastures. When grazing lands were taken over and turned into cultivated fields, the available area of pasture land declined. Similarly, the reservation of forest meant that shepherds and cattle herders could no longer freely pasture their cattle in the forest. As pasture lands disappeared under the plough, the existing animal stock had to feed on whatever grazing land remained. This led to continuous intensive grazing of these pastures. Usually, nomadic pastoralists grazed their animals in one area and moved to another area. These pastoral movements allowed time for the natural restoration of vegetation growth. When restrictions were imposed on pastoral movements, grazing lands came to be continuously used and the quality of pastures declined. This in turn created a further shortage of forage for animals and the deterioration of animal stock. Underfed cattle died in large numbers during scarcities and famines. How did the pastoralists cope with these changes? Pastoralists reacted to these changes in a variety of ways. Some reduced the number of cattle in their herds since there was not enough pasture to feed large numbers. Others discovered new pastures when movement to old grazing grounds became difficult. After 1947, the camel and sheep-herding Rikas, for instance, could no longer move into Sindh and graze their camels on the banks of the Indus, as they had done earlier. The new political boundaries between India and Pakistan stopped their movement, so they had to find new places to go. In recent years, they have been migrating to Haryana, where sheep can graze on agricultural fields after the harvest are cut. This is the time that the fields need manure that the animals provide. Over the years, some richer pastoralists began buying land and settling down, giving up their nomadic life. Some became settled peasants cultivating land, others took to more extensive trading. Many poor pastoralists, on the other hand, borrowed money from moneylenders to survive. At times, they lost their cattle and sheep and became laborers, working on fields or in small towns. Yet, pastoralists not only continue to survive in many regions, their numbers have expanded over recent decades. When pasture lands in one place was close to them, they changed the direction of their movement, reduced the size of the herd, combined pastoral activity with other forms of income, and adapted to the changes in the modern world. Many ecologists believe that in the dry regions and in mountains, pastoralism is still ecologically the most viable form of life. Such changes were not experienced only by pastoral communities in India. In many other parts of the world, new laws and settlement patterns forced pastoral communities to alter their lives. How did pastoral communities elsewhere cope with these changes in the modern world? Pastoralism in Africa. Let us move to Africa, where over half the world's pastoral population lives. Even today, over 22 million Africans depend on some form of pastoral activity for their livelihood. They include communities like Bedouins, Berbers, Masai, Somali, Boran, and Turkana. Most of them now live in the semi-arid grasslands or arid deserts where rain-fed agriculture is difficult. They raise cattle, camels, goats, sheep, and donkeys, and they sell milk, meat, animal skin, and wool. Some also earn through trade and transport. Others combine pastoral activity with agriculture. Still others do a variety of odd jobs to supplement their meals and uncertain earnings from pastoralism. Like pastoralists in India, the lives of African pastoralists have changed dramatically over the colonial and post colonial periods. What have these changes been? We will discuss some of these changes by looking at one pastoral community, the Maasai, in some detail. The Maasai cattle herders live primarily in East Africa, 300,000 in southern Kenya and another 150,000 in Tanzania. We will see how new laws and regulation took away their lands and restricted their movement. This affected their lives in times of drought and even reshaped their social relationships. Where have the grazing lands gone? One of the problems the Maasais have faced is the continuous loss of their grazing lands. Before colonial times, Maasai land stretched over a vast area from North Kenya to the steppes of northern Tanzania. In the late 19th century, European imperial powers scrambled for territorial possessions in Africa, slicing up the region into different colonies. In 1885, Maasai land was cut into half with an international boundary between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. On Tanganyika, Britain conquered what had been German East Africa during the First World War. In 1919, Tanganyika came under British control. It attained independence in 1961 and united with Zanzibar to form Tanzania in 1964. Subsequently, the best grazing lands were gradually taken over for white settlement and the Maasai were pushed into a small area in South Kenya and North Tanzania. The Maasai lost about 60% of their pre-colonial lands. They were confined to an arid zone with uncertain rainfall and poor pastures. From the late 19th century, the British colonial government in East Africa also encouraged local peasant communities to expand cultivation. As cultivation expanded, pasture lands were turned into cultivated fields. In pre-colonial times, the Maasai pastoralists had dominated their agricultural neighbors, both economically and politically. By the end of colonial rule, the situation had reversed. Large areas of grazing land were also turned into game reserves like the Masai Mara and Samburu National Park in Kenya and Serengeti Park in Tanzania. Pastoralists were not allowed to enter these reserves. They could neither hunt animals nor graze their herds in these areas. Very often, these reserves were in the areas that had traditionally been regular grazing grounds for Maasai herds. The Serengeti National Park, for instance, was created over 14,760 kilometers of Maasai grazing land. Pastoral communities as well in Africa faced similar problems. In Namibia, in Southwest Africa, the Kaokoland herders traditionally moved between Kaokoland and nearby Ofamboland, and they sold skin, meat, and other trade products in neighboring markets. All this was stopped with the new system of territorial boundaries that restricted movements between regions. The nomadic cattle herders of Kaoko land in Namibia complained, We have difficulty, we cry, we are imprisoned. We do not know why we are locked up. We are in jail. We have no place to live. We cannot get meat from the south. Our sleeping skins cannot be sent out. Ophon land is closed for us. We lived in Obhambo land for a long time. We want to take our cattle there, also our sheep and goats. The borders are closed. The borders press us heavily. We cannot leave. Statement of Kaukoland herders, Namibia. In most places in colonial Africa, the police were given instruction to keep a watch on the movements of pastoralists and prevent them from entering white areas. The following is one such instruction given by a magistrate to the police in southwest Africa, restricting the movement of the pastoralists of Kauko land in Namibia. Passes to enter the territory should not be given to these natives unless exceptional circumstances necessitate their entry. The object of the above proclamation is to restrict the number of natives entering the territory and to keep a check on them, and ordinary visiting passes should therefore never be issued to them. The loss of the finest grazing lands and water resources created pressure on small area of land that the Maasai were confined within. Continuous grazing within a small area inevitably meant a deterioration of the quality of pastures. Fodder was always in short supply. Feeding the cattle became a persistent problem. The borders are closed. In the 19th century, African pastoralists would move over vast areas in search of pastures. When the pastures were exhausted in one place, they moved to a different area to graze their cattle. From the late 19th century, the colonial government began imposing various restrictions on their mobility. Like the Maasai, other pastoral groups were also forced to live within the confines of special reserves. The boundaries of these reserves became the limits within which they could now move. They were not allowed to move out with their stock without special permits, and it was difficult to get permits without trouble and harassment. Those found guilty of disobeying the rules were severely punished. Pastoralists were also not allowed to enter the markets in white areas. In many regions, they were prohibited from participating in any form of trade. White settlers and European colonists saw pastoralists as dangerous and savage, people with whom all contact had to be minimized. Cutting off all links was, however, never really possible, because white colonists had to depend on black labor to pour mines and build roads and towns. The new territorial boundaries and restrictions imposed on them suddenly changed the lives of pastoralists. This adversely affected both their pastoral and trading activities. Earlier, pastoralists not only looked after animal herds but traded in various products. The restriction under colonial rule did not entirely stop their trading activities, but they were now subject to various restrictions. When pastures dry, drought affects the life of pastoralists everywhere. When rains fail and pastures are dry, cattle are likely to starve unless they can be moved to areas where forage is available. That is why traditionally pastoralists are nomadic. They move from place to place. This nomadism allows them to survive bad times and avoid crises. But from the colonial period, they were the Maasai were bound down to a fixed area confined within a reserve and prohibited from moving in such a pastures. They were cut off from the vast grazing lands and forced to live within a semi-arid tract prone to frequent droughts. Since they could not shift their cattle to places where pastures were available, large number of Maasai cattle died of starvation and disease. In these years of drought, an inquiry in 1930 showed that the Maasai in Kenya possessed 720,000 cattle, 820,000 sheep, and 171,000 donkeys. In just 2 years of severe drought 1933 and 1934, over half the cattle in the Maasai Reserve died. As the area of grazing land shrank, the adverse effect of the droughts increased in intensity. The frequent burials led to a steady decline of animal stock of the pastoralists. Not all were equally affected. In Maasai land as elsewhere in Africa, not all pastoralists were equally affected by the changes in colonial period. In pre-colonial times, Maasai society was divided into two social categories, elders and warriors. The elders formed the ruling group and met in periodic councils to decide on the affairs of the community and settle disputes. The warrior consisted of younger people, mainly responsible for the protection of the tribe. They defended the community and organized cattle raids. Raiding was important in a society where cattle was wealth. It is through raids that the power of different pastoral groups was asserted. Young men came to be recognized as members of the warrior class when they proved their manliness by raiding the cattle of other pastoral groups and participating in wars. They, however, were subject to the authority of the elders. To administer the affairs of the Maasai, the British introduced a series of measures that had important implications. They appointed chiefs of different subgroups of Maasai, who were made responsible for the affairs of the tribe. The British imposed various restrictions on raiding and warfare. Consequently, the traditional authority of both elders and warriors was adversely affected. The chiefs appointed by the colonial government often accumulated wealth over time. They had a regular income with which they could buy animals, goods, and land. They lent money to poor neighbors who needed cash to pay taxes. Many of them began living in towns and became involved in trade. Their wives and children stayed back in the village to look after the animals. These chiefs managed to survive the devastation of war and drought. They have both pastoral and non-pastoral income and could buy animals when their stock was depleted. But the life history of the poor pastoralists who depended only on their livestock was different. Most often they did not have the resources to tide over bad times. In times of war and famine, they lost nearly everything. They had to go looking for work in the towns. Some ate out a living as charcoal burners, others did odd jobs. The lucky could get more regular work in road or building construction. The social changes in Maasai society occurred at two levels. First, the traditional differences based on age between the elders and warriors was disturbed, though it did not break down entirely. Second, a new distinction between the wealthy and poor pastoralists developed. Conclusion. So, we see that pastoral communities in different parts of the world are affected in a variety of different ways by changes in the modern world. New laws and new borders affect the patterns of their movement. With increasing restriction on their mobility, pastoralists find it difficult to move in search of pastures. As pastures land disappears, grazing becomes a problem, while pastures that remain deteriorate through continuous overgrazing. Times of drought become times of crisis when cattle die in large numbers. Yet pastoralists do adapt to new times. They change the paths of their annual movement, reduce their cattle numbers, press for rights to enter new areas, exert political pressure on the government for relief, subsidy, and other forms of support, and demand a right in the management of forest and water resources. Pastoralists are not relics of the past. They are not people who have no place in the modern world. Environmentalists and economists have increasingly come to recognize that pastoral nomadism is a form of life that is perfectly suited to many hilly and dry regions of the world. तो इसी के साथ हमारा आज का चैप्टर ख़त्म होता है। तो अगर आप चैनल पर नए हैं तो चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और नोटिफिकेशन आइकन पर क्लिक कर दीजिए ताकि आप डेली लाइव क्लास ज्वाइन कर सकें। और अगर आपको वीडियो अच्छा लगे तो लाइक कर दीजिए, साथ ही अपने दोस्तों के साथ शेयर कीजिए ताकि उन्हें भी हेल्प हो। तो हमारा आज का सेशन यहीं तक था। थैंक यू, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।